Computer. All right, I am here with Mr. Colonel Chris Wyatt. I'm so used to saying excuse me, Colonel. How are you doing today, Colonel?
Well, Tommy, I'm fine. Thanks for asking me to come on the program. It's a pleasure. Always a great opportunity to talk to folks I haven't had a chance to converse with before. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, this should be fun. As my audience knows, my wife is South African, and you do a lot of work with South Africa. So it was when I ran across you and ran across your channel, it was something I was very interested in keeping track of. Because you were working with the refugees, and I thought it was so interesting the work you were doing and how you were dedicating your time and helping the new refugees from South Africa, and the heart you have for the Afrikaners and the Boer people, that I just couldn't help but ask you to come on the show.
Well, yeah, it's great to be on here. I started using my YouTube channel and I made one mistake. I should have created a business channel. But when I retired from active duty in October of 2019, just before the COVID scam began, I decided to start a consultancy. And then the COVID scam started. And I'd had these trips booked to Ghana and Senegal where I was going to be paid a lot of money to tell
Mm.
people about those places to get US businesses to invest there. And I get to travel there. So it was really exciting. I was really excited about my new consultancy. And then the COVID scam, I couldn't travel. You couldn't go anywhere, remember?
Right.
So what am I going to do? I said, well, first off, my hip wasn't messed up at that time. It was getting worse, but I didn't know it. So I exercised. I'd walk an hour and a half in the morning, an hour in the evening, and run 3 days a week to stay fit. So I stayed, healthy and that sort of thing for my body. But my mind, my ability to communicate is my stock in trade. So how do I do that? I could write, and I still write, academically and for newspapers, but to engage people because, sitting at home, when everyone's out wearing masks or you can't go anywhere, how am I going to engage? So pretty early on during the COVID scam, I started using my existing YouTube channel to make videos about topics in Africa that if I would refer a business to my channel and say, "Hey, see, you want to learn about me? Listen to me talk about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or about ECOWAS, or about SADC, or about counterterrorism, the Sahel." You can go watch these videos, and that's what started it. And that channel, my original channel, went from 2 subscribers after 15 years because as an intelligence officer on active duty, I couldn't be putting up a lot of videos. That's inappropriate. So now I'm no longer in active duty. So that went from 2 to 23,000 subscribers. And then after the election, YouTube started coming after me and accusing me of violating their community standards, which I never did. They removed my channel after 3 months of harassment on probably about 40 of my videos, most of which were restored. And then I started another channel, but I lost that channel. And 2 years later, they gave that channel back after I appealed it a third time to prove that they were frauds, that I never broke the rules. But anyway, a bottom line with this is that I started a new channel in April of 2021. And that channel has grown to almost 130,000 subscribers at this point, about half in South Africa and the rest around the world. In fact, today, somebody jumped into my stream asking me a question about why we're not sending ATACMs to Latvia. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm in Latvia. We've received the launchers, but we never got the missiles." I'm like, "Well, that's because we gave them to Ukraine. I can't help you with that."
You're a retired colonel. You're not actively making those deals at this moment. So,
No, and in fact, I mean, I never sold ATACMS, but I was responsible in security cooperation for selling defense materiel to countries in the Middle East and Africa. So yes, I have been in that business before,
yes.
an arms dealer.
There you go. So, what was that? Lord of War with Nicolas Cage?
Yeah, not quite that exciting, but yeah, that's yeah. Except he was in the private sector. Yeah, no, it's
Right, right.
yeah, no. The stuff we mostly sell to Africa are like helicopters and tents and uniforms and HIV equipment, stuff like that.
Right, right. So, well, I wanted to ask you about there were the protests last week. Was it June 30th? They had the protests around the country. It doesn't look like, from the coverage I saw you covering, it doesn't look like it got too out of hand. It looks like there were some like small incidents here and there, some looting in some places, but it didn't look like it got too crazy. And I noticed you had made comments about the size of the protests and the size of the crowds. And I was just wondering, how much do you think that the decimation of USAID played into the lack of money going to fund those protest movements?
Well, AID money should never be funding those protest movements. If it's done, then there's some corruption. There needs to be an investigation into it. In the 60s and 70s, the U.S. government gave its assistance money largely
Mhm.
to foreign governments, and they weren't bright enough to realize that that money was going to be stolen and looted and misused. And then eventually they woke up. By the 1980s, we began reforming that process, and most money from USAID before it disappeared was going to third parties,
Mhm.
non-governmental organizations or
Right.
religious affiliations. So none of that money should have gone for that. The money that we were spending in South Africa, for instance, most of it went to fight HIV. Some of it went for regional trade and for harmonization of trade. And there's a few other things it went for. But in other countries where I work, for instance, in Liberia, we use money like that to build schools and clinics and also to run healthcare programs, dig wells, things like that. And also, there was money set aside to help them rebuild their free press because the press was obliterated during the war. There was no press essentially. So I don't think USAID money had anything to do with that. The protests themselves, I believe, are being funded by dark money that no
Mhm.
one can account for. They claim they were funded by their Back a Buddy program. Back a Buddy is like a GoFundMe in South Africa. But if you go to the March and March, one of the two main groups behind this xenophobic, Afrophobic, racist attacks that are taking place, you'll see that they raised the equivalent of about $4,000.
Mhm.
This was nationwide. Now, I will give them credit that they did have protests all over the country. But as I said, it was really a nothing burger from a standpoint that they didn't muster many people. The biggest protest of all was down on the East Coast in the tropical zone of Durban in that city, which has a large Indian population. There were no more than 4,000 people, I'd estimate, based on the crowd size. And I saw photographs from different times during the protest. Two different groups, three groups converged on each other at one point, but you could see the gap between them as they came together. There was no more than a few thousand people. And we were led to believe this is going to be tens of thousands. The protest, many of the videos that you see, one of the things is as an intelligence officer and as a counterintelligence agent in particular, one of the things we get trained on is crowd size estimation. It's an art.
Mhm.
It's not a science, but you learn how to estimate crowd sizes based on the imagery, based on the distance away, based on the density, that sort of thing. And so that's not exact science. I'm not. You can't hold me to 4,000, but I'm telling you, it wasn't many people. If you look at the videos, you'll see that. But my point with this is that these were really nothing burgers, and it's disappointment across the board for these people. They made a big stink about it. But there were more Malawians at the border crossing to flee through Zimbabwe to get into back to Malawi gathered over 35,000 than there were probably in all the protests of the country combined. And as you
Mhm.
said, there wasn't much in the way of violence, but there was violence, including in Johannesburg area where people were breaking into homes and dragging people out in the streets claiming they were foreigners. It's look, this is a very serious problem. The issue is not the foreigners, and I'll be very clear on this, just like I am in America. If you violate my sovereignty, you're a criminal alien invader. You're a felon in my book. When you slip across the Rio Grande or come across the Canadian border without authorization at a border post, you're a criminal, and you should be treated as a criminal. Same thing in South Africa. No one has a right to go wherever they want. States are sovereign and they have a right to protect their sovereignty. That said, no one has the right as vigilantes to go around and beating people up, burning their houses, destroying their businesses, attacking them because they believe someone's illegal. In fact, this is so out of hand that a few months ago, white South Africans going to a clinic in Durban were accosted by this Operation Dudela, which is the other group that's doing this March and March and Operation Dudela. Operation Dudela came up and got in their face, and they had like axe handles with them and threatened white South Africans who were trying to get into a state-run health facility, a public hospital, and demanded they show papers. Well, they're
Mhm.
South Africans. What papers do they need to show? So yeah, no one has a right to harass people as a vigilante, but the government, just like our government, needs to deport people who have no business in the country. And
Right.
until recently, we've not had that willpower. We had it under Obama. Obama deported more people than Trump has done. Still, Obama deported over 3 million people, and we're still not talking about that. Trump has only deported 1.2 million so far, or thereabouts. Now another 1 point something million have self-deported. That's a whole
Yeah.
different story. But
Right.
anyway, the point is that yeah, it was not really the big event that many people feared, and that I warned people was possible. I didn't say it was going to happen. I said it was possible. Better to be forewarned and forearmed than to be shocked and caught off guard.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely a true scenario. When you talk about the problem being the ANC, and it parallels the U.S. in so many ways. One of the things when I started looking at South African politics and the history of South Africa, it was after my wife and I had gotten together, and she had said it was during when they were tearing down the Confederate statues, I guess it was still under Obama. It was before Trump was in office, and she had said that if America's not careful, it's going to end up being South Africa. And as I started looking into South African politics, I could really see the parallels and the trajectory that America is on. And I say we might be 10 years behind South Africa if we continue going the trajectory that we're on at this moment.
Well, it's an interesting statement, and there are clearly parallels here. Helen Zilla, the one of the most famous politicians for what was an opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, wrote a book a few years ago called "Go Woke, Go Broke," and it's ironic because she's leftist, she's left of center, and she's woke in some respects herself. But I think she's more a pragmatist. But her party is definitely woke. Her party promotes gay rights and gay pride parades, and they love state control of private enterprise. They just think the ANC does a poor job. They could do a better job of it. And so they're also an apologist for a lot of policies, a lot of the policies that are run by the ANC. So it's ironic that she talked about this go woke thing because there are so many things that and she claimed in her book, the reason I mentioned her book is because in her book, she says this all started in America. Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, some of this, rules for radicals and some of this democratic socialism got its foothold in the States back in the 60s, and it crept along for decades. And yes, we are responsible for some of this. But many of these things come to a manifestation in a major way in South Africa first. And it started with fees must fall at University of Cape Town, where lazy students demanded that they get free education. They thought they had nothing to play. Because they're black, they're entitled to free tertiary education. Nobody's entitled to university education. It's a privilege. Less than 1% of human beings on this entire planet ever attend a single minute of a university lecture or class. Less than 1% of humanity. And for arrogant black supremacists in South Africa to demand that they get free tuition is unacceptable. No one should get free tuition. You should have skin in the game. Now that doesn't mean if you're poor, you shouldn't get assistance. I mean, we as taxpayers or they as taxpayers can create programs where people economically don't have the resources, whether it's grants or loans, but you don't just get the fees must fall and you just get to do what you want. And that started. And then at Rhodes University, they attacked the statue. Of course, Cecil Rhodes gave the money to found that university and they attacked him. And the Confederate statue thing, here's the problem with that. If you don't like statues, that's your prerogative. And I'm not in favor of the Confederacy. It was a rebellion against federal authority. 7 of my 8 great-grandfathers fought in the Civil War. 7 of the 8, the other was in his 50s, so he's too old. And of those 7 of the 8, every one of them fought for a Union regiment, even though they came from Maryland and Virginia. Every one of them fought in a Union regiment against the Confederacy to preserve the Union, to end slavery. And that's a fact. But the thing is that if you don't like those, I don't have a problem with a Robert E. Lee statue in Virginia. He's from Virginia, and his family did a lot for Virginia. Mm-hmm. In New York City, there's a statue of Joseph Stalin. While I find it offensive, if people want to put a statue up of Stalin in a park in New York and they're dumb enough to, believe in a communist, that's their prerogative. I don't have a problem with these statues. If we were going to remove statues of people who were treasonous or turned against the United States or people we didn't like, well, then there would be no statues of any Native Americans. The Native Americans fought against the United States. Mm-hmm. So should we destroy every Native American monument and every Native American museum and every Native American name? Well, we're going to have to rename Massachusetts. We're going to have to rename the Susquehanna, the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, it's just stupid. And people who seek to erase history are just frauds. Yeah. History is painful. History is ugly. It's the reality. But these idiots actually threw paint on the 54th Massachusetts Regiment statue in Boston, an all-black regiment, except for its commander, Colonel Shaw. The rest were all black. And they fought valiantly at Fort Wagner. And of course, the movie with Denzel Washington was created about that. And these people, they're so stupid. They attacked that. These were free black men and former slaves who enlisted in the Union Army to end slavery and gave their lives for it. And they attacked that. If you just destroy things you don't like, then you're not a legitimate person. And that's the problem with the political left around the world. They're not legitimate. They are just like the Soviets, just like the Cultural Revolution in China, just like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. These people seek to stamp out history because their methods are wrong, immoral, and don't work. And if you hide the rest of the history, people can't refer to anything else. That's what this is about. We should remember the Civil War. And if people in the South want to put monuments up, fine. Gettysburg has monuments to every regiment that fought there. None of them paid for by federal taxpayers. Everyone raised by the regiments themselves or their descendants or the state legislatures in their states. Look, these people are nasty and they don't belong in a public conversation.
Right. Well, and I had seen that I'd watched a documentary a couple of years back about the formation of the ANC and how they were trained by the Vietnamese in communist tactics. That the Soviet Union had funded the Vietnamese to go train the ANC in communist guerrilla warfare tactics, and that's when they started their attacks on on the townships there in South Africa in order to put pressure on the impoverished people to join their movement and therefore overthrow the apartheid government. And and you look, I was talking to a friend of mine who the other day told me he's like really digging deep into Rhodesian history. And I said, well, if you want to start looking into Rhodesian history, you got to trace it back to South Africa and the Dutch East India Company coming into Cape Town and just that movement, that migration north, and how the migration of the Africans coming south and the migration of the Dutch moving north created clashes and created these wars that eventually came to pass. And when I look at American history, I look at it in a very similar way. It was this emergence, these people moving from the east towards the west, and trying to establish a foothold and create their own polity and their own way of life. And so it's very interesting looking at the frontier life back then and how it all emerged. And to put rose-colored glasses on it is a falsehood, but in order to point at it and say, oh well, it was the worst thing in the world, they were genocidal, that's not a true characterization of what was actually happening. These people were looking for a life and they were creating their own life. And the Dutch that stayed in South Africa fell in love with that land, and they truly love that land. My wife just she'll break down into tears talking about how much she loves South Africa and misses it because there's so much heart and soul in that nation.
Well, there's a couple issues there, and I'll go to the second one first and then come back to the ANC. You're talking about the parallels between U.S. and South African history, this drive for the U.S. for manifest destiny across the continent from sea to shining sea, the love of faith, family, and firearms, to be honest, that was also inherent in the United States as it was in South Africa. And, it's interesting because a lot of historians, a lot of political scientists look at this only from the Afrikaner perspective. But the same thing applies to the Nguni speaking, the largely black Bantu tribes of South Africa as well. They're not indigenous. They don't come from there. They came from Cameroon. And 1,600 years ago, they crossed the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers in what are the borders for Zimbabwe, and then the border for Zimbabwe with South Africa, Limpopo, and entered South Africa. And they pushed aside the Khoi and San, or they integrated with them in some respects, but mostly pushed them aside. Look, the Bushmen don't live in the Kalahari because it's a lovely place to live. They live there because they were marginalized 1,000 years ago and pushed into the desert by other groups. And so there's interesting parallels there. But let me go back to the other thing about the ANC. The ANC was actually founded in 1912, and it was the South African Native National Congress. So there's another N in there. And then it was renamed at some point the African National Congress instead of the South African Native National Congress. Sol Plaatje and a colored South African and a few others were responsible for founding it. The ANC, throughout its early years and most of existence, was a non-factor in South Africa. However, with people like Nelson Mandela joining the movement, I think he joined the 50s, if I'm not mistaken, maybe sooner. But people like that joining, they came to the realization that a peaceful movement was not going to achieve the aims they wanted, which was to overthrow the government. They claimed it was, for unity and for everybody sharing the government, but they really wanted to remove the government of the day. And so what they did is they turned to an armed struggle, and they created something called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which its abbreviation is MK. And today there's a political party which has usurped that name. MK became the armed wing of the African National Congress. Now, they had no weapons, they had no training, and so they were given succor and refuge by the East Germans, by the Soviets. They were armed by the Chinese communists, and they fled to places like Tanzania and Zambia and other independent countries in Africa. And then, of course, they were also in Angola. and they wound up fighting back against the apartheid regime, but they were never effective. Now, they had some bombing campaigns and domestic terrorism in South Africa. They took out initially some TV transmission towers and remote radio station towers and things like that. But eventually, later on, they began bombing bars and cinemas and restaurants and killing people. But initially, they didn't kill people. So they were a terrorist group. And the Rivonia trial is very famous. At the Rivonia trial, the spies for the government got into their groups and arrested a bunch of them, including Nelson Mandela, and they were all convicted in 1961, if I recall correctly. Now, Sharpeville was a big shooting and called a massacre, but that's not the true story. A lot of innocent people died, but these protesters were out there in 1960 at the provocation of political groups who were pushing for a confrontation with police, and they got it. And the world was reviled at Sharpeville in 1960. That was the first big incident during the apartheid era. Then the Mkhonto we Sizwe movement, they rounded up their leaders. They tried them. They put them in Robben Island in prison, which was where Mandela stayed until the early 1990s. So at that time, the ANC's armed wing was obliterated. They had no value. They were doing nothing. The subsequent bomb attacks and the actions they took came afterwards when they reformed outside the country. And most of what they did is they actually tortured and murdered their own people in their camps in Angola because they thought they were spies in a place called Quatro. But until 1979, the ANC was a term that virtually nobody talked about in South Africa. They were disbanded, they were ineffective, they were illegal, they couldn't do anything in South Africa, and they had no traction. Other groups like the Pan-African Congress, and then those who opposed apartheid inside the government, like Helen Suzman, who was a liberal Democrat, and also people in the media would fight against it publicly. And they wound up getting banned, which meant they couldn't be in public. They had to stay in their home, basically house arrest. So the ANC, as you alluded to, tried to figure out, what do we do? We can't accomplish anything. In 1976, there were riots in Soweto because the government decreed that all primary school education would be conducted in Afrikaans, which is the language of only a small percentage of the population as a first language. Mostly the coloreds and Afrikaners. A few others speak it, some blacks and some Indians, but not that many at the time. Just a few million people. So the students rioted in 1976 in Soweto. It took the government some time to get control, but the ANC didn't play a role in that. And they're trying to figure out, how can we play a role? So in 1979, they sent delegation to Vietnam after they won their conflict against South Vietnam, after the United States left there in 73 and 75, the whole thing fell. So 4 years later, they went there and they listened to them and they learned the concept of the People's War. You turn the people into a force and of all sorts. And so they learned the tactics and techniques of the Viet Cong and of communists. Now, it took the Viet Cong decades to achieve this, but in South Africa, it happened much faster because the Cold War was coming to an end, which is never really put into this. So what happened was that they came back with the tactics, and that's when the terrorism really started after 79. The bombing attacks all happened in the 80s and the early 90s. So then what happened was that the ANC in 1985, that was the next round of Soweto riots when they tried to impose Afrikaans again. And that one went on for like 9 months. It took the government 9 months to get control of that. It was out of control, and that was all over the press. South Africa was reviled in the world press. They were seen as pariahs. But then a major event happened. The Berlin Wall fell. And when the Berlin Wall fell, and Glasnost and Perestroika and the Soviet Union collapsed, and Boris Yeltsin, the Cold War was over. From a standpoint that there was no longer a major financial backer of all these movements, and the Chinese didn't have the resources. Their economy was not even $1 trillion back then. So as opposed to now where it's 18 trillion. Anyway, so what happened was the ANC, because the media latched on to Nelson Mandela, and before that, Winnie Mandela. Most people didn't know who Nelson was outside South Africa because he'd been in prison for 20 years, 27 years. But Winnie Mandela carried the flag and carried the cause for Nelson Mandela and the ANC. People didn't know who Oliver Tambo was, who was the president of the ANC in exile. And they didn't know, I mean, some people knew, people that know, historians, political stuff, but the public didn't know for the most part. That came about because Winnie Mandela staged a public campaign to keep Nelson Mandela's name in the press, and he became the face of the apartheid, anti-apartheid movement. And the ANC, by default, got credit for ending apartheid. Apartheid did not end because of the ANC. Apartheid ended because the Cold War ended. The National Party capitulated because it was unsustainable what they were doing. They had turned South Africa into a police state against all of its citizens, not just blacks, but white, black, and brown. And so with the end of the Cold War, they could no longer justify it. They saw the handwriting on the wall, and they called for a referendum, and 62% of the whites who voted said, we need to change our form of government. And unfortunately, they sold South Africans down the river to a system where people are selected by parties and not by the voters, and you have no recourse, and criminals work in government, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's kind of like, a 3-minute history of South Africa in the
Right.
20th
Yeah.
century.
Yeah. It's there's so much complication. There's a guy, I'd run into, I can't think of his name. He's a white gentleman. I believe he's English, but he was raised in South Africa, and he was involved in the government in the ANC. And he, when they came to power, he left, and he was talking about how, um, I'm so bad with names, forgive me, but he was talking about how it was actually um, the vice president under Mandela who was actually running the government, and when Mandela stepped down, he actually took the presidency. I can't remember his name for the life of me.
Thabo Mbeki.
Thank you. Um, I kept wanting to say Malema, and I was like, I know that's not it. So, so he was saying that Mandela was good at playing the politics of being the front face, but he wasn't the brain behind it. And it was when Mbeki actually got control over all the levers of power is when Mandela actually stepped down, because when going into office, Mandela's health was already so bad that he really couldn't do the job. He was just the front facer facing kind of HR spokesman for the country, and that Mbeki was doing all the hard work behind the scenes, and that it was actually getting the levers of power and getting people put into place in the different organizations within the government. And that's when the downturn of South Africa actually began to take place. And so when I look at that and I look at where South Africa sits today, and the allowance for the EFF to go around with Malema singing "Kill the Boer" and the violence against the farmers and what had happened in, what was once Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and how that turned such a beautiful nation into this economic crisis that we see today. I can't help but feel this concern for South Africa, and not because it's white people, but because they're going to destroy the entire nation based upon racism and this black nationalism that they spew so violently.
Well, my take on that is a little bit different than what your friend told you. So let's talk about Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was a boxer,
Mhm.
a pugilist. He was a barrister. He was a liberation fighter. He was a terrorist. He was a president. And he was all those things. And he told people he was all those things. So when I call Nelson Mandela a terrorist, people would get offended. Well, those are his own words. He said he did it because there was no option. Mandela came to power elected by the parliament, not by the people, but he would have won an election hands down with the people because he was the face and that's what they saw. But there was a power struggle within the ANC when he came out of prison because he had not been in ANC leadership for the 27 years he's in prison. And Oliver Tambo kind of stepped aside and let Mandela take that mantle, which was the right move. So Mandela came in as president, and he didn't know how to run a government. He'd never been in a government, and he didn't know that when he said things that people thought that that's how it's going to be. So the problem with Mandela is he ran around everywhere. Went, oh, you don't have water here. We'll get you water. Well, now people had to run around behind him and find a way to get water to this remote village that didn't have any pipes and no lines or electricity. And the power lines are, miles away. Right. So a lot of effort was done because Mandela meant well from that standpoint. But the one thing that Mandela really deserves credit for, two things actually. Number one, he was genuine about reconciliation between black and white South Africans in all races. He really was. And you can see it in his actions. I know it's a movie, but if you watch Invictus, it's a pretty accurate portrayal of what happened with the national rugby team, the Springboks, in 1995.
It was a good movie, yes.
It's a pretty good movie. Matt Damon did all right with his accent. Wasn't too bad. but anyway, yeah. So but there's a lot of truth in that movie. And so he genuinely meant that. So the things he did before, judge him however you want. I'm not a pro or anti Mandela. I'm a historian, and so I'm objective. Now, the thing he did that I think is the most valuable for political leaders around the world, but especially in Africa, is after one term he left office. He could have stayed in office for the rest of his natural life, but he led the country through a transition and he stepped off the stage. The deputy president you're talking about, there were actually two deputy presidents in the beginning. One was F.W. de Klerk, the former president, the white guy who became one of the deputies as part of the reconciliation, and Thabo Mbeki was the other. A lot of people thought it was going to be Cyril Ramaphosa, but it wound up at that time being Thabo Mbeki. The thing about Thabo Mbeki is he's a technocrat. Thabo Mbeki was educated in the UK. During the liberation struggle, he lived abroad in comfort and then came back to South Africa. He and a cadre of these technocrats that were educated in Harvard and Yale, Oxford, and so on, those people came back and that formed a core of technocrats for the ANC. The problem is that they began trying to push the whites, the Indians, and coloreds out of government who were qualified in government or in education and things like that, and replace them with people who weren't so qualified or not even at all qualified. They were just loyal to the political party. Right. Now, the decline actually started after Mbeki, but the roots of it are during Mbeki's time. He was an AIDS denialist. When asked a question about HIV, he said poverty is the cause of HIV, as if being poor gets you a virus that destroys your immune system, because he's an idiot. And the reason is because his small-minded, view of the world is that when someone talked about the reasons for HIV in Southern Africa, they obviously had a problem with black men's sexuality. And that's not the case. Because in America, it was mostly hemophobes, or hemophiliacs, not hemophobes, hemophiliacs, and gay and bisexual men who were getting HIV at this time. It wasn't spread in the heterosexual population. However, in Africa, and in Southern Africa in particular, it was like wildfire through the heterosexual population. The biggest difference between the U.S. and Southern Africa at this time was sexual behavior and the nature of the environment. So the nature of the environment is that there were many guest workers in South Africa, came from neighboring countries or within South Africa who worked in the mines, and their families, their spouses were back in the other countries, or they were back in other parts of South Africa, and they had long times away from their spouses. Additionally, you have these long distance truck routes that run from the Congo through Zambia, through Botswana, through Zimbabwe, and down to South Africa, bringing raw materials to port and shipping goods back and forth. What do truckers do who are on the road? I'm not just trying to despair all truckers. I'm not trying to, but let's be honest. And businessmen are the same way. When the cat's away, the mice will play, sort of thing. Except the mice are the ones that are away. So these guys would sleep with prostitutes, a lot of them, and multiple partners, no protection, and these sexually transmitted infections spread. That was one of the contributing factors. And another is that in Africa, many people have multiple concurrent sexual partners. In other words, you're sleeping with more than one person at a time. Now, when this was presented, he was defensive as a black man. Well, you're commenting on the sexuality of black men. No, we're being honest here. On average, people in Africa have the same number of sexual partners as somebody in Europe or North America. I mean, except for the Democrats. We know they have thousands. But anyway, no. But But the point is that over the course of a lifetime, it's the same number of people, essentially, people sleep with on average. But at one time, it can be more when people are younger. So he had a small mind, and so he blamed HIV on that. And he had a doctor that was trained in the Soviet Union. They called her Dr. Beetroot because she said you cure HIV by eating beetroot. Anyway, over 500,000 South Africans died because of HIV during his stupidity. So he started the seeds for this collapse of the economy of the country. Now, during his period of time in office, the country grew economically most of the time. And in fact, they reached 6.5% growth one of those years. But that was driven by the Chinese commodity boom, not by their policy. Their policies weren't sound, but they weren't destructive. Now they're destructive. When Jacob Zuma replaced him in what I call the Polokwane massacre, when the ANC met in what used to be Petersburg in the north of the country for their conference, they voted and he was voted out. And even though he was the head of the party, he's still president. But then he resigned as president because he's no longer leader of the party, because they see the party as more important than the republic. Right. So he left office, and then Jacob Zuma took over. Jacob Zuma was a intelligence operative for MK, that armed wing I talked about in Angola. Jacob Zuma knew where all the bodies were buried. And so he blackmailed people into voting for him. Otherwise, he would expose their collaboration with the government or their corruption. And so he became the president. And it started a period of pervasive corruption and influence peddling. And the country's never recovered. Not that there weren't always problems from the outset, but some of it's understandable. People with no experience in government, the liberation movement come into power. There's going to be a little bit of low-level corruption. There's going to be some incompetence because people don't know. But after 30 plus years, you should have rooted that out and you should be on solid ground. But instead, educational standards have been lowered. Passing grades in South Africa to go to university are 30% in 3 subjects and 40% in your first language. Can you imagine taking a test and you're 40% proficient in the language that's your mother tongue and you're allowed to enter university based on that? That's absolutely insane. And so the country's become basically a kleptocracy, and a lot of racial hatred has been spread by politicians who fail and use racial hatred as an excuse for their failure. The good news is that most South Africans are wise to this, or they're becoming wise to it. So parties like the EFF, which you mentioned before, Julius Malema, they've never gotten above 15% nationally, and now they're down to 9% nationally, and they're collapsing. In the most recent national election in 2024, in KwaZulu-Natal, a province where they were hoping for a surge in votes because people are unhappy with governance there, they declined to less than 2% of the vote. They're a party that's on its way out. Once Julius Malema is put in prison or he leaves that party, it will collapse. It's a vanity project. And the same thing with the Mkhonto weSizwe party, the MK party. 83-year-old Jacob Zuma, former president who was accused of corruption but been delaying the trial for 20 years, once he dies, that party will disappear. There's nothing to it. So we'll see what happens after that.
Well, so I had heard, and maybe you can correct me on this, the way I had understood what was going on with the MK party and the reason that the EFF was losing some of their influence was because of the MK party has become like a Zulu party. Is that accurate?
Well, it hasn't become. It's from the outset been a Zulu party. That's from the very formation.
Okay.
That's the people that are almost entirely Zulu. The interesting thing is they've actually won a few, by-elections, like when somebody dies or they resign from office, like Nigel Farage just in the UK just resigned from his MP seat, and he's going to run unopposed, so he's going to be reelected. But those are called by-elections. We don't generally have them in the U.S. We have them occasionally, for a senator who dies in office, a state will conduct it, but we don't use the term by-election. That's a by-election.
Yeah, we call them special elections.
Yeah, we call them special. We call them special elections, but they call them by-elections because they're between, those happen all the time in South Africa. Interesting thing is the MK party actually won a couple constituencies on city councils in the Western Cape, which is nowhere near the Zulu, and there's virtually no Zulu there. So their appeal is a little broader than just Zulu. Also, the Zulu heartland is KwaZulu-Natal province, obviously on the East Coast. But there are millions of Zulu who live in the main province, the economic heart, Gauteng, which is Johannesburg, Pretoria area. So both of those places are strongholds for them, but more so KwaZulu-Natal. The EFF has lost support across the country. They have places, and if you look at the EFF, virtually every one of the supporters is an angry, upset member of the ANC. That's why they joined the EFF. Similar with the MK, but there's also the ethnic aspect of it where Zulus glom onto the party. They have a little support beyond Zulus, but mostly it's Zulu. The EFF is mostly, and all of them are former ANC for the most part. But there is a party on the horizon that is actually causing chaos, not just for the ANC, but also for the Democratic Alliance, and that is the Patriotic Alliance under Gates McKenzie, which has an ethnic component too. The vast majority of its voters are colored. And for the U.S. audience, colored is not a 1950s racial insult. In fact, for nearly a century, black and white people called black people colored. It wasn't an insult. That's just what they were called. But that term in the U.S. isn't the same as colored in South Africa. Colored in South Africa is a distinct ethnic group comprised of people who mix with Europeans and the Khoi and San, and in some cases Africans, but also people from Malaysia who were brought into the Cape Town area as slaves. And they have a whole group, a subgroup called the Cape Malays, and another group of mixed race people called the Griquas, and then one group called the Bastas, which, yes, that stands for bastard because they were mixed race and often illegitimate. But those people, like the comedians who embrace the N word, what I'm saying? They embrace that word. Same thing with Basters. The Basters is actually a community in Namibia, in a town called Rehoboth, right in the center of Namibia, called the Rehoboth Basters, which about 300 or 400 of them migrated from South Africa up there 150 years ago or so, and settled there to get away from the Cape government, get away from white rule, and get away from British rule later on, and went up there. And there's like 40,000 of them now, and they're very proud. Some of them look as white as I do. Some of them are darker. Some are olive skin color. It depends, and the genetics of the people coming out. And they have Dutch surnames. They have French surnames, which is where the Afrikaners, there's a mix of Germans, Dutch, and French. And they're very proud of it. So the Colors, the Patriotic Alliance, is a party that's on the ascendancy. And it has taken a lot of by-elections in the past year or so from the the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape, but also they're now in the Eastern Cape and they've taken it from the ANC. This is a party that's making both those large parties very nervous. So South African politics is quite bizarre. There's over 535 registered political parties, I think. Most of them have almost no votes.
Yeah. Well, I've seen Gayton McKenzie going around doing some podcasts, doing some interviews. He's a very interesting character. I mean, I don't have any issues with him. I haven't really listened closely to what his politics are, but it sounds like he's much more aligned with my style of politics. If I were to be in South Africa, which is something my wife does want to do, she does want to move back to South Africa and buy a flat in Cape Town and, just live in paradise, as Rob Hersov would say. So, but that's her dream, and that's what we're working towards. So hopefully that does come to fruition at some point. Um, so, but yeah, Gate McKenzie does seem like a very interesting political operative, I guess would be the word. Do you think that, because I had seen reports that it looked like the DA was starting to pick up steam in Johannesburg. So does it look like there's going to be a presence in Joburg for the DA?
Well, they do have a presence there. They're the second largest party in Johannesburg, but I don't know that they're picking up any pace. A lot of this is the positive press that Helen Zilla's been getting. She's chosen to drink from a poison chalice, and I wish her well. She's decided to run as the face for the party to win the majority in the city council to become the next mayor. Good luck with that. That's a city that's so broken that it's going to take decades to fix it properly. Or if you had an outright majority, you could force things through. Then it could be done much quicker. But there's not going to be a party gets an outright majority. The DA is not going to get 50 plus 1% of the vote. And therefore, they're going to have to form a fragile coalition with other parties. And other parties want things. They want deputy mayor positions. They want to be on this committee. They want this. They want that. And so that's the problem with South African politics, is that these smaller parties can never get an outright majority and show that they can govern. There are exceptions. Cape Town and the Western Cape has been run by the DA for years. Nelson Mandela Bay was briefly run by a coalition with the DA in charge, and it was a fantastic coalition under Athol Trollip. There are cities that the DA runs in other places, like in Gauteng. They run a couple of municipalities there, but most of this stuff is a coalition with other parties. And so Midrand is the place I'm thinking of. It's well run. It's in the southeast corner of Johannesburg. But Johannesburg is a poison chalice. I don't think they're getting traction. They won a by-election, and they beat the ANC by 8 votes. Over 1,100 votes for each party. They won by 8 votes. I wouldn't say that's a surge or resurgence. That's the story they're running with right now. We're on the rise. I don't think they're on the rise. The problem the DA has is that under John Steenhuisen, the caustic, arrogant, vindictive, venal former leader, he did so much carnage to the party because of his arrogance and his stupidity and his ineffectiveness, and he doesn't even realize it. And the party itself hasn't come to terms with that. He was just ousted as leader recently, although he would say he didn't run. Well, you didn't run because you were told not to run. Otherwise, your problems that you have personally are going to be exposed. That's why he didn't run. But the bottom line is that the DA ran as an opposition party for decades, and they stood, it's like Barack Obama. There's a line in the sand. You will not cross it here. And they said this on major policy issues that affect all South Africans, including things like the Basic Education Laws Amendment, which was just passed. Now, these bills were all in the previous parliament when the DA wasn't part of the government of national unity, which it is at the national level now in a grand coalition. But if they're in the government of national unity, they should have influence on the president and be able to convince him not to sign something that's dangerous for South Africa. But they've not even spoken out against these things for most parts. The Basic Education Laws Amendment means that all South Africans who go to primary school, the day they walk into school, will be taught in English regardless of their first language. I mean, South Africa erupted in flames in 1976 and 1985 by the imposition of Afrikaans, which is actually an African language, whereas English is a colonial language, and they're claiming the opposite. And so this is the law of the land now, and also gives the provincial government total control over local school boards. And we've already seen how screwed up education becomes when national governments control it. Right. Here in America, the good educational outcomes are a consequence of local control and local ownership of education. Mm-hmm. So that's one. Another is expropriation without compensation. The Constitution says you cannot expropriate property without just and fair compensation agreed to by both parties. That's Section 25 of South Africa's Constitution, promulgated by a majority black government and instituted by a majority black government in 1996. So that Constitution prohibits this. But they passed a law last year, and this is what led to Trump's executive order and the refugees. They passed a law last year signed by Ramaphosa when he was in Davos, although he'd already signed it in South Africa. But he did so. He did it in this fashion because under South Africa's constitution, if a bill is passed by Parliament and signed by the president, if 1/3 of the members of Parliament object to it, they can sign a petition, and it must go to the Constitutional Court within 30 days for constitutional review. Must, under the law. But because he waited 34 days after he actually signed it in South Africa and pretended to sign it in front of the cameras in Davos, no one could file a complaint against it. There was nothing they could do. So that's fraudulent. But the DA stood against expropriation with compensation. They screamed from the rafters. Now they're in government. They have nothing to say. They're challenging it on a procedural matter rather than challenging it on constitutionality. So they're pussyfooting around things. And then there's other things like national health insurance, the government takeover and communization of the healthcare sector, making it illegal to have private practices. And everyone works for the government, which has already been a disaster, as we can see. The list goes on and on of all these things that the Democratic Alliance claim they're opposed to. But now that they have ministerial positions and a bump up in their pay because they get extra money for being a minister, and now that they have a little bit of power inside the government, they're not standing on principle. And so I strongly believe the DA is going to take a serious hiding in the next election, these elections in November 4th, local elections in particular. They think they're doing well. At best, they'll hold their own. And if a miracle of miracles, they might gain 1 or 2% nationwide. But nationwide doesn't matter. It's in local constituencies because you can get 26% of the vote around the nation. But if you didn't get a majority anywhere, you're not ruling anything. And if you can get enough seats in one of these towns, you're not even going to get coalition. Having 26% means nothing nationally in local elections. So I don't think the DA is going to do very well in this election. They think they're going to do well. I think they're whistling past the cemetery. Yeah. So I think they're just whistling past the cemetery and they're not going to do very well. By contrast, the Patriotic Alliance, I think, will do very well. And the Freedom Front Plus is also going to do well because I think a few 100,000 voters from the DA at a minimum are going to go back to the Freedom Front Plus or leave the DA for good. Not that my audience is representative, but of 127,000 people, I frequently do polls. And the vast majority of people in my program, even though it's not representative of all South Africa, are adamantly opposed to the Freedom Front Plus. Now, or excuse me, the DA, the Democratic Alliance. Now, many people would say, well, that's because, your audience, you cater to your audience. Well, I don't cater to my audience, but yes, I will admit that my audience tends to be center or center right. That's true for the most part, but not exclusively. But here's the thing. When I first started doing these polls 6 years ago, 85% of those white folks that watch my program and black folks were voting DA. Now it's almost 0%. And my audience is 6 times as large as it was then. Right. So that's an indicator of some sort, to say the least.
Yeah, I think I heard about the Freedom Front Plus probably about 5 or 6 years ago. One of my buddies that does a podcast had interviewed the leader of the party years back, and but because they were kind of like a libertarian leaning party, they were a little bit more libertarian leaning, and we working with the Libertarian Institute, they had come across his radar, and he had interviewed them. I think the work they're doing is interesting. I haven't kept up with them lately. I think the last I heard about them was a couple of years ago, but it's good to know that they're actually making some headway and peeling back some of the votes from the more corrupt parties, which I had a feeling that that's the avenue the DA was going down, because aren't they operating under a coalition government right now between the DA and the ANC?
Yes, what happened is that in the election, by the way, I predicted in 2021, 1 week after the municipal elections, looking at the data, I predicted that in 2024, which is over 3 years later, 3.5 years later, that the African National Congress would decline from the 56% they had in the previous, or 57 the previous national election. I said they would get 38 to 42% of the vote. Now, conditions changed over that 3.5 years, but I stuck to my analysis because, in my view, the things that went for them and against them were balancing out. And in the end, the ANC got 40% of the vote. So I hit it right in the sweet spot there. So the Freedom Front Plus is a party that I forgot your question by telling my story there. What was your question again? Sorry.
Oh, I was asking about the coalition government.
Oh, yeah, the coalition. Yeah, that's where I was going.
It's mainly DA and ANC. right?
Well, yes, and no. So here's the deal. The ANC, that's where I was going with the percentage. The ANC didn't get an outright majority at the national level for the first time. So they can't form a government.
Hmm.
They need help. In order to form I mean, they could technically form a government, but then everybody could stop everything they're doing because they don't have 50 plus one of the vote in parliament. So the parliament has 400 members. You need 201 people in order to get everything through. They didn't get that. So I think they got like 160 or something, whatever the number is. Anyway, so they needed a coalition partner. The natural partner, which would put them over the 50%, was the Democratic Alliance because they got around 22%, and so that's about 62% of the vote. That's plenty. That's all they needed. So the two parties negotiated over a 2 week period and agreed to form a coalition. Then once they did that, they had an agreement on paper, the principles. The ANC, because they were worried they would lose their voters because the Democratic Alliance is viewed by people as a white party, and that's
Hmm.
evil somehow. So, yeah, somehow being white is evil. Anyway, so because of their concern about losing their diehard core supporters, they went behind the Democratic Alliance's back and invited 8 more parties to come into it to give the veneer of a government of national unity, a grand coalition. But this grand coalition, these are parties that have virtually no votes and virtually no members in parliament in some instances. But the Freedom Front Plus is part of it. The Inkatha Freedom Party is part of it. The Patriotic Alliance is part of it. And so all these African Transformation Movement, I think, is part of it, which is a radical black party. All of them came together. And so it is a government of national unity. But the ANC retain control of all of the major powers, levers of power in the country. So who
Hmm.
controls the military? ANC, the minister. Who controls the police? The ANC. Who controls intelligence? The ANC. Who controls foreign policy? The ANC. Who controls finance? The ANC. What is left that is a power in the country? Nothing. Forestries, there's no power there. Home affairs, there's no power. The real
Agriculture.
power,
Yeah.
yeah, agriculture. The real power is in the hands of the ANC. They did not release any of the sole control of violence, state violence. They have all of it. They're the ones who can do that. So they have the Justice Department. They have everything, everything. And so the DA, even though it had the second highest percentage of votes, didn't get a commensurate percentage of ministerial positions to go along with their number of votes. So they've been a weak partner from the outset. And all the other partners are pretty much just along for the ride, with some exceptions. But I mean, basically, that's the point. So it is a grand coalition, but the ANC runs the country without consultation of its partners as if they run the country with a majority. They do what they want. They don't consult anybody. In fact, when the Freedom Front Plus sent representatives to America to meet with the Trump administration to find out what South Africa can do to improve the relationship, they came back with a list of demands. They weren't demands, there's 5 preconditions that need to be addressed, not solved, but addressed, including disavowing the kill the Boer chant by the government officially. And so they came back with these 5 conditions, and the president of the republic refused to meet with Corne Mulder, who's now the leader of the Freedom Front Plus, but
Right.
he's also the senior parliamentarian. He's been in parliament since the apartheid era, even though he's
Hmm.
my age. He's not that old. He was a young parliamentarian. So he's been in parliament longer than anyone else in South Africa. Ramaphosa refused to give him an office call to explain what the Americans wanted. Now, remember that South Africa had no ambassador in America for over a year, and this was during that time.
Right.
And part of the coalition went to America to try to get answers on how the South African government doesn't want to improve the relations with the United States. They want this fractured relationship so they can play the part of the martyr and the victim. They think
Right.
they're going to get their support from Tehran and from Moscow and from Beijing, which
Hmm.
hasn't been forthcoming. It's a very dangerous game for them to play. But the bottom line here is this coalition is a joke. It's accomplished nothing in 2 years. They're talking about the economy recovering. South Africa's economy this year is growing at 0.5% GDP growth. After 3% inflation and 1.6% population growth, the country is poor. And so but they keep trying to play it up in the press as if this coalition is creating jobs and bringing security. 82 people per day are murdered in South Africa. The United States has 6 times the population of South Africa. In 2024, we had 17,000 murders. South Africa had 27,000 murders, a country 1/6 the size of ours. It's
Right.
insane.
Yeah.
Insane.
Yeah. It's nuts. Um, I wanted to ask about, oh man, I lost it. I should be writing things down.
Well, we never got around to the refugees. Did you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I was going to get there here in a second. I had, oh, that's what it was. I just wanted to ask real quick. When it comes to the expropriation without compensation, now I saw the other day that there was a lawsuit about BEE going down. Do you think there will be lawsuits surrounding the expropriation without representation, without compensation?
Well, there are lawsuits already, one of which
Oh,
the
okay.
Democratic Alliance has actually got, but the one that they've put in is a procedural one. They're not contesting the constitutionality of the law, which is clearly unconstitutional. The
Right.
Constitution is clear. There's no ambiguity about it. So the DA has got a lawsuit, and some other civic groups have got lawsuits, but the other ones are contesting the constitutionality of it. But South Africa's courts move notoriously slow.
Okay.
Expropriation has already happened. We've already caught people who work for the government and don't work for the government stealing land, and nothing's been done about it. Within a week of Ramaphosa signing that thing in Davos last year, there was a group of people, and the South African national broadcaster SABC actually went out, and their journalist was on the scene. He had his microphone. He's talking to these people outside a town called Polokwane in the north. It used to be called Petersburg, north of Pretoria, up north. And all these people went out to farm, or this farmland they claimed was disused, and there's 100 something. They're just out there to start staking out plots and taking over the land. And he said, "We're expropriating this because the president said we can. We're taking this land. It's not used. It's our land now. And we expect the city of Polokwane to deliver roads, electricity, and water and sewage services to us." Now, SABC covered the story. And then I covered SABC's coverage of it. And then the reporter, I've never seen him again. Now, maybe he's
Oh,
still
really?
reporting for SABC, but maybe he doesn't have a job. I don't know. But that story was quashed quickly. So that was expropriation, illegal expropriation by squatters, and the government did nothing to stop it.
Right.
In addition to that, shortly after that, near Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, down on the southern coast of South Africa, police went out and stole a farm and sold plots to illegal settlers and gave them land. And there's never been a resolution to that. In the past, whenever people stole land illegally, the government habitually, under the ANC, went out and removed these people from the land at some point. You get a court order to take them off of it. That isn't happening for the most part anymore. We've also had a game ranch or tourism site that was stolen by the government in expropriation without compensation, even though it was against the law several years ago. And the media tries to cover up saying it was never expropriated. Oh, it was, but the courts overturned it, returned it to the owner, and then they put pressure on the owners, and they eventually were forced to sell it because they were spending so much money on legal fees fighting these illegal seizures that they sold it. And the media says, "Oh, but they made a profit because the government offered them like 20 million and they sold it for 62 million or something like that."
Hmm.
But the thing is, it was worth a hell of a lot more than that, but they saw the writing on the wall. So they, not only that, why should they be forced to sell their business? It's not even a land claim by people who claim to have been dispossessed under apartheid. Those people are still demanding the land back. They never got it back. A Saudi prince owns the land now. The whole thing is a scam. These people are criminals. They're grifters. They'll steal anything. They'll lie about everything. And they'll use race to blame people. I mean, for years, they've been blaming Jan van Riebeck, who was the guy who established the colony in Cape Town in 1652. And if it wasn't Jan van Riebeck, they blamed apartheid for their failures. Now they've turned in the Jan card for a Trump card. Everything in South Africa that's failed is Donald Trump's fault. And Donald Trump has done nothing to them except suspend aid, which was being misused, and that's the end of that story. But when you can blame someone else, especially when you blame color, that's an easy path.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask you that question though, because that gets us right into what's going on with the refugees. I had heard I think you reported, was it yesterday, maybe the day before yesterday, there are now over 8,000 South Africans that have taken refugee status in the United States.
That's correct. The numbers come out once a month from the U.S. Customs Immigration Service, and this year the government initially had a very low cap of 7,500, 7,000 reserved for South Africans, 500 for the rest of the world. But as of now, only 3 people who are not South African have come over. That was in November. 3 Afghans went to Colorado. That's it. All the rest have come since at the beginning of this fiscal year, have all been South African. There's 8,062 who've arrived in America. 6 have returned to South Africa for various reasons, and 3 have passed away to my knowledge. Now, my numbers may not be the most accurate, but I would argue that I have more contact and greater access to the refugee community in America than even the U.S. government at this stage.
And so, what as they're coming over, how are they? You seem to keep in touch with a lot of these people as they come over. How are they adapting to life in America? What are the lines looking at as far as the amount of people that are applying for refugee status? How's that operating?
Well, we don't know the number. The only figure we know publicly, we know some anecdotal stuff based on what people told us, based on what the South African Chamber of Commerce had some information just within a week of this happening last year provided to the U.S. Embassy, and speculation analysis. The only number we can hang our hat on is Marco Rubio testified in open Senate hearing in late May last year, just before Memorial Day, Now, mind you, the statement of interest, they had the PRM email, which is the Population Resettlement Migration branch of the State Department. When this started, they asked people to send an email to them saying if they're interested in the refugee program to find out if there was any interest because they want to start a pilot program because it's in-country refugee, which is rare but not unprecedented. We did it in Cuba, we did it in Bosnia. So they had to get a feel for this. And that was the PRM email, as it's called. And then the other was a statement of interest on the 12th of May. Well, in late May, Rubio testified in an open hearing that 72,000 or 75,000 applications or statements of interest had come in. That was last year, 2 weeks after the window opened up. Now we're 17 months in this process. I don't know how many, but my own estimation based on what I've seen is probably 250,000 people have applied for this, which can mean as many as 600,000 people if they come over. But that's not happening. The pace is far too slow. But as far as seeing people, a refugee gave me this map board. You can see the pin cushions on here, places I've been where I've met refugees. Twin Falls, Idaho, Las Vegas, Dallas, Texas, Birmingham, Alabama, Tampa, Orlando, Florida, Monroe, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Greenville, South Carolina, Spartanburg, Kings Dominion, Virginia, Richmond, Harrisonburg, Columbus, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Erie, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, Rochester, Carlisle, Pittsburgh, where else? A couple other places here in Pennsylvania, Riverdale, Maryland, and also Rockville, Maryland. I've been over 30 meet and greets, and I've been to those are the places I've been across the country meeting refugees. Now I've done all that largely my own expense. I've had a couple sponsors who volunteered cash a couple times and helped a little bit with airfare and stuff like that. But I've traveled around the country. In person, I met with over 1,200 of those 8,000 refugees that have come to America since last year. And I have been in contact, as I said, with about 3,500 at this stage, either through emails or coming onto my program or, also interviews I've done. I've done 50 or 60 interviews of refugees around the country. And I would say that the vast majority are having good experience. I know a South African that 4 months after he arrived last year managed to buy a home in Iowa. He bought a home. I know several South Africans that are making six-figure incomes now that have come over here. Most of them achieve success within 90 days. Having said that, there are problems. There are some people that were failures in South Africa that will be failures here. Unfortunately, the program doesn't screen for failure. It screens for eligibility. So if you're a loser there, you're going to be a loser here. There are some people who are belly achers and whiners and complainers that did it there and do the same thing and blame everyone else for their problems. But most of these people are hardworking, dedicated, honest people that want to succeed and want to escape persecution. The vast, overwhelming majority of them. I would say that between 3 and 5% of the cases have run into problems. Now, the majority of those are not the people themselves. The majority of those are actually the agencies that handle refugees for a couple of reasons. One, most of these are run by leftist hate wankers who have no respect for South Africans and who have no historical knowledge and blame white South Africans who were born after apartheid for events that occurred before their lifetime because they're stupid people, not the South Africans, but the leftists. Right. And so we have some leftists that have actively undermined the program once refugees arrive here and treated them abysmally. But I've also come across a case where refugee agencies have been abusing all refugees. I went to Rochester, New York in January this year and discovered that Church World Service had been abusing Afghans and Nepalese and then the South Africans when they arrived. Now, the other problem with the South Africans, and it's not a problem per se, but it's a problem for the refugee agencies because they're perplexed. You have to understand most refugees who've been coming to America for the last 30 years have been people of color who aren't Christians, who don't speak our language, who come from broken third world countries, escaping war or persecution or communist governments, and they're just glad to get out and they don't know what to say or do. They're afraid they'll be sent back. And some of these agents take advantage of that. They tell them, you keep complaining, we're going to send you back. Well, they have no authority to do that. Only the U.S. government can do that. But these people don't know any better. Mm-hmm. And so they take advantage of them. And sometimes they hold on to the money. Sometimes it's used. I've uncovered massive fraud in this program for refugees that goes back years and years and years. Nick Shirley's got a lot of attention for the Laring Center in Minneapolis. Yeah. Well, that's recent. This fraud with refugee is going back 40 years. And we spent $12 billion on refugees in fiscal year 2024. How much of that was in fraud? If even 3 or 5% of that was there, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars per year and probably billions over the course of this. So some of these people take advantage of refugees. And then the third reason why it's a problem. So some of it's the refugees themselves, a very small number. Some of it's the agents. And the other part of this is that sometimes the agents mean well, but they don't know how to deal with people that can speak to them in English and ask legitimate questions like, what about this, my Social Security appointment? What are we supposed to do for healthcare? How does the insurance work? What about you? Usually they're accustomed to coddling and nannying and, babying these refugees, because not to speak ill of the other refugees, but they're just not accustomed to being in a first world country, whereas South Africa was a first world country.
Right.
And so they're accustomed to it and they have expectations. And the expectations are not unrealistic. It's just that many of these agents have never seen this before. So they don't know how to respond, because to them, a refugee is someone that you have to hold their hand all day long. Whereas many of the South Africans don't need to hold a hand. They just need to be told which direction to go. And so there are some cases that are problematic. And that's, I think, the three main reasons why they're problematic. But the vast majority of these people are doing very well in America. Some are out earning my income. I'm kind of envious. But then I don't want a 40-hour job. I do my own deployment.
I understand. I just always think about I think about the refugees coming over here, and I just always think about that scene in Lethal Weapon where the guy's like, "But you're black."
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, that was with Danny Glover. Yeah, who recently, I guess he has Alzheimer's, shame, or dementia, something like that. Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
It's been, I've been watching your clock, so I've been trying to keep track. It's been a little bit over an hour. You want to plug everything you got going on, and hopefully we can hook up again and do this again.
Well, first off, if you're watching my clock, that is a Chinese clock that loses time. So I only keep it on the screen just as a reference for my videos when people try to claim that this is an old video or something like that. So it's a reference point. It's actually about 6 minutes behind right now. That's because for 2 months, the reset button won't let me change the time. I used to every month, this Chinese clock that I bought, which by the way was $33 when Trump came in office a couple years ago, and now I can get it for $23. So much for that Trump inflation going the opposite direction. But I can get it for $10 left with the shipping included from Amazon from China. But yeah, that's about 6 minutes behind. So I haven't been able to fix it in 2 months.
Yeah, it is 6 minutes behind. I just looked at my phone.
But yeah, we probably have been talking for about an hour. So if people are looking to find me, you can find me in a host of places. But the biggest presence is on YouTube. You go to YouTube at Colonel Chris Wyatt, all one word, Colonel Chris Wyatt, W-Y-A-T-T. Be careful, there are fraudsters out there. Someone the past 24 hours has stolen my photograph of me in my dress blues, which is on my channel, and has created a fake channel and misspelled my last name and put a phone number trying to defraud people. So you got to be careful. I get a lot of that. The bigger you get, only the tall trees catch the wind. So you got to be careful about that. But you can find me on YouTube there. Also, if you follow rugby, I have a channel called Rugby Ascendant, as in rising. I do play-by-play and color commentary of rugby there, particularly for South African teams and the South African national team and the U.S. team. You can also find me on X at WMW Chris, Whiskey, Mike, Whiskey, Chris, like C-H-R-I-S. I'm on X there. I've been on there forever. I didn't really put much on it because it was a leftist hate-wanking platform that attacked conservatives until Elon Musk bought it. And now it's a hate-wanking platform that attacks everybody, not just conservatives. So it's equal opportunity offender now. But and then also I began using my Facebook account more recently. I stayed away from it because Facebook is not a trustworthy platform. But you can find. But you can look for me, Colonel Chris Wyatt, on Facebook if you want. But the best place to follow me is really the YouTube channel, the main one I have. I have several YouTube channels, but that's the biggest focus. I have a US channel, the one that got restored, but I put videos on there occasionally. But most of my audience is from around the world, including US. South Africa first, then US second, then the UK third. And, like today I had somebody from Latvia watching my program, and we've had them from Taiwan, and even communist China people popped in, but they're very careful about what they say.
I bet they are.
Yeah, so that's how you can find me. I'm also a radio host on WSMN, which is based out of Nashua, New Hampshire, every Wednesday night from 7 to 9 Eastern Standard Time. Myself and my two colleagues, tonight I have the lead. We talk about politics. U.S. politics in particular. You can catch it on my YouTube channel or my X channel if you want, or you can just go to WSMN.live every Wednesday from 7 to 9 p.m. And we talk politics. But I also have Substack and all that crap. But I mean, that's the big. If you want to follow me, you'll find about everything by going to YouTube and watching me on at Colonel Chris Wyatt.
Yeah, I'll definitely put a link to your YouTube channel too. And you said your rugby channel's Rugby Ascended?
Rugby Ascendant. Yeah, I've only got about 11,000 subscribers on there, but I've done hundreds of games. So what I do is a lot of people in South Africa in particular can't afford to pay for the satellite television service. It's pretty pricey. but they love the sport. And so people ask me because they liked my personality, I guess, at least somebody did. They asked me if I would do the games, and I know the game. And as an American, I think I shock a lot of people that my knowledge of rugby. And I've interviewed a lot of famous South African rugby players in the past and some Americans as well, including Nas Botha. He and I had a little segment during the World Cup in France when I was in France because I go to all the World Cups. And we would do I do interviews with him after the game. We do game analysis. It was really popular. But so what I do is like Saturday, South Africa's playing Scotland. I pay for all the subscriptions because it's not like you go into baseball, you just go to your local channel. It doesn't work that way in football.
Yeah.
You've got to have subscriptions to all these different sites. And so I pay for those subscriptions. Most of them, one or two are free, but most I pay for. And then I watch the game and I do play-by-play and color commentary. I keep the score updated and I keep the scoring updated and stuff like that. And then the yellow cards and red cards are handed out. And I do analysis at halftime, and it's pretty popular. I mean, I've had as many as 168,000 people show up for one of my broadcasts with the Springboks last year. But most of my games get 2 or 3,000 views. I just did South Africa versus England last week. I had 22,000 tuned in. So a lot of people like my enthusiasm and my approach to it. And frankly, for a lot of South Africans, it's a different accent. You know, you know how Americans always like love Australian or English accents,
Right.
you know, so this kind of works in my favor that way. There's a number of people that do this on YouTube, but I would argue that I'm the most enthusiastic and engaged person that does it. And I think people like that.
Well, I'm going to sub because my wife and I are always have always struggled finding places to watch the games when there's a big game on. So if
Well,
nothing else,
if you want to watch the game this weekend, at the risk of losing your viewership, but because I always share, Rugby Pass TV. Rugby Pass used to be its private thing, but World Rugby took them over. That game will be broadcast for free. Just go to rugbypasstv.com and or look it up, and then create a free account. And you'll find under the schedule, you'll see all the games that, you know, the New Zealand game, the Japan game, the England game, and then you'll see the South African game, which is on 11:40. So I'll start my broadcast probably about 11:30. But what a lot of people do in South Africa, they actually have it, or around the world, they'll put it on the screen and mute the television, and they'll watch my video and listen to my commentary while they're watching it.
nice.
Yeah, so that's an option for you if you want to try it. But go to Rugby Pass TV. You'll be able to watch the Nations Championship. And the reason you can watch it there is because in North America, there's no contract for the rights yet. It's a new competition, just started last week. So all the other things are wrapped up. The sevens are controlled by NBC and Peacock. Some of the national tests are controlled by Paramount Plus, so you have to subscribe to those networks. But in this case, it's free for now. And then most of the South African games that I broadcast are actually on Flow Rugby, and that's a separate subscription. But those games won't start until the Curry Cup in a few weeks. But anyway, so that's kind of that. But yeah, if you want to subscribe, I appreciate it. But if you want to watch the game, you can do it that way.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording.